It was 1952, and the world was on the brink of another great conflict. The United States, still recovering from the devastation of World War II, found itself embroiled in a new struggle. This time, the war wasn't in Europe or the Pacific. It was on American soil. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union had reached a boiling point. Tensions between the two superpowers had escalated into a full-scale war. The Soviet Union, having developed its own atomic weapons, launched a surprise attack on the United States. The nation was caught off guard as missiles rained down on major cities, and troops began landing on the East Coast. As the government scrambled to respond, a small town in the heart of Pennsylvania, Liberty Ridge, became the focal point of the American defense. The town, nestled between mountains and surrounded by dense forests, had no strategic importance, except that it was home to a military base that held critical reserves of ammunition and supplies. Sergeant John Harris, a decorated veteran of World War II, was stationed at Liberty Ridge. He was an experienced leader, hardened by battle and unflinching in the face of danger. But nothing in his past had prepared him for the horrors he would soon witness. The war arrived at Liberty Ridge on a cold November morning. The sky was gray, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the smell of burning fuel and the distant sound of explosions. Sergeant Harris stood at the front gate of the military base, watching as the first waves of enemy soldiers advanced toward the town. Soviet paratroopers had parachuted in the night before, and now their ground forces were closing in. Harris quickly gathered his men. "We may be small, but we're not going to go down without a fight," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Get to your positions. Prepare for the worst." The soldiers moved swiftly, taking cover behind the thick walls of the base and the scattered bunkers that dotted the town. The enemy had numbers, but Liberty Ridge had something the invaders hadn't counted on, a determination that could not be broken. The battle raged for hours. The Soviets were relentless, pushing forward with tanks and artillery, but the American forces, though outnumbered, fought fiercely. Harris's unit held their ground, using the terrain to their advantage, striking the enemy from hidden positions and launching surprise attacks. The town itself became a maze of trenches and barricades, with buildings reduced to rubble. But as the hours turned into days, the situation grew dire. The Soviet forces were beginning to overwhelm the defenses. The small American garrison was running low on ammunition, and reinforcements were nowhere to be seen. Harris knew they couldn't hold out much longer. In the early hours of the fourth day, as the snow began to fall, Harris gathered his officers for one final meeting. The town was surrounded, and there were only a few routes left for retreat. They could abandon the town, fall back into the mountains, and try to regroup. Or they could make a stand, fight to the last man, and defend Liberty Ridge at all costs. "We can't give up," Harris said, his voice filled with determination. "This isn't just about Liberty Ridge. It's about showing the world that we won't back down. We have to make them understand that they can't just walk all over us." The officers nodded. They knew what needed to be done. The decision was made, there would be no retreat. That night, the American forces launched a desperate counterattack. With what little ammunition they had left, they stormed the Soviet lines. Harris, leading the charge, felt the weight of every step. Bullets whizzed by, and explosions shook the earth beneath them, but the soldiers pushed on, driven by a fierce will to protect their home. The battle was brutal. Bodies littered the snow-covered ground, and the air was thick with smoke and the stench of death. But the American forces fought with an intensity that the Soviets had not expected. They fought for their country, for their families, and for the very spirit of freedom that had defined the United States for centuries. By the time the sun rose, Liberty Ridge had been reduced to a wasteland. The Soviet forces, now weakened, began to retreat, realizing that the small town and its defenders had become a symbol of resistance. Harris and his men had held out against all odds, and their bravery had bought the United States the time it needed to regroup and launch a counteroffensive. The battle for Liberty Ridge was not the end of the war, but it marked a turning point. The Soviet Union, recognizing the resolve of the American people, began to question its ability to win the war. The United States, with the spirit of Liberty Ridge in their hearts, would go on to push back the Soviet invaders, eventually winning the war and securing a lasting peace. Sergeant John Harris, though wounded, stood tall amidst the wreckage of Liberty Ridge. He had seen the worst of humanity and the best of it. He had witnessed the destruction that war could bring, but also the unyielding courage of those who refused to surrender. And in that courage, he found hope for the future. As he looked out over the battlefield, he knew one thing for certain. No matter how dark the days ahead might be, the flame of liberty would never be extinguished.